Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we'll be listening to Know Your First Amendment Rights, a session that was presented at Children's Institute 2025 in Portland, Oregon.
Hi friends, welcome. Thank you for coming. I think we can get started. It looks like everyone is settled into their respective sessions. So I recognize a lot of you. For those I haven't met, I'm Philomena Polefrone. I'm the Associate Director of American Booksellers for Free Expression, which is the American Booksellers Association's Freedom of Expression Initiative. So I want to talk today about the First Amendment and specifically how the First Amendment applies to booksellers. And the reason I want to do that is because, do I really need, you know, right? You know why I need to do this right now. But let me just say, in case you don't, that unsettled First Amendment law is being tested. Settled First Amendment law is being intentionally unsettled so that it can be tested. Libraries and schools are under attack by ideologues who only want their speech to be free. No surprises there, right? It's kind of always been that way, but it's even more so, more now than ever. And because the First Amendment rights of indie booksellers are mostly solid, mostly protected for the time being, but there are people who want that to change. And the more informed we all are as booksellers, the more resilient we can be to the attempts to attack those First Amendment rights. So this really is about fundamentally knowing your rights, but it also is going to end in some really clear takeaways that I think you can put into operation in your store to help you defend those rights. So I'm just going to give you a tour of some of the fundamental issues that come up in First Amendment rights in bookselling, but I'm going to end on 5 actionable points. So before we get into the fun stuff, and yes, I do consider First Amendment case law to be the fun stuff. Sorry, just to let you know what you're in for here. I want to do some housekeeping. The slide decks and handouts and everything are going to be available after the session through the Children's Institute app and on the program of bookweb.com. .org. It's fine. I don't know our URL. You'll get used to it. Please, I always forget to say this. After the session, please submit a session evaluation. That really, really helps me just understand what's working, what's not, and kind of continue improving these presentations from institute to institute. You can get a recording of this session on BookWeb and via our education podcast, Booked. Please silence your cell phones. I will make fun of your ringtone if it goes off. And if you have questions or comments, please save them to the end. Raise your hand and someone will come around with a microphone, or you can come up to the microphone to ask your question. That helps with the recording, and it helps make sure that everyone can hear your question so that my answer doesn't seem like I'm talking to myself. All right. So before we get into the free speech, let's talk about some forbidden speech. It's forbidden for very good reasons, which is to say antitrust guidelines. Booksellers are encouraged to share ideas and support during the conference, but the Sherman Antitrust Act prohibits you from discussing price or pricing policies, boycotts, or dividing up the market. And if you have questions about this, talk to Dave, our antitrust expert in the back, or go to bookweb.org. And a legal disclaimer. I know that I'm literally indistinguishable from Reese Witherspoon in Legally Blonde. Thank you so much for saying that. But I'm not a lawyer. I haven't been to law school. I haven't passed the bar, and I'm not licensed to practice law in any state, including this one. So the purpose of this is information, not legal advice. If you need legal advice, talk to someone who has gone to law school and has passed the bar and is licensed to practice law in your state. So here's the agenda. I want to begin with just the basics, what the First Amendment is, and just as importantly, what it is not. I want to talk about what I mean when I say curation is the bookseller's speech. I'm going to say that a lot. That's intentional. That if you take away one thing from this presentation, I want it to be that. Curation is speech. I want to talk about the obscenity exception to the First Amendment. Again, what it is and what it is not. I want to talk about abuses of the obscenity exception, which these days is most of the times that you're going to hear about the obscenity exception. And I want to talk about the 5 takeaways. But, those of you who know me, I don't like to give medicine without a little bit of sugar. So every once in a while, Elle Woods from Legally Blonde is going to pop up and try to keep things interesting for us. Okay, so let's talk about the basics, what the First Amendment is and what it's not. So here's the First Amendment. I've broken it up into the 5 freedoms that it covers. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and the freedom to petition the government. So, freedom of religion, there's 2 pieces to this. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This is referred to as the Establishment Clause, better known as the separation of church and state. This is super important in terms of just making sure that things like, that you can't force people to study religion in public schools, that you can't force people to practice a certain religion. If that sounds like that's been getting a little bit shakier lately, we'll talk about that. And it might have something to do with the way that the second part of this freedom of religion clause is interpreted. The freedom to, there will be no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. This is sometimes interpreted, especially by this Supreme Court, as something that, anything that might cause you to have to respect beliefs that do not go along with your own religion. Though this Supreme Court really likes to interpret those as discriminatory. So the 2 parts of this freedom of religion part tend to be in tension, not because they have to be, but I want to suggest that because that is how the current courts have been interpreting them in somewhat opportunistic ways. Freedom of speech is where we're going to linger for the majority of this. And again, the question of curation as speech. I want to focus on places where people seek to create exceptions to this idea of freedom of speech, which is something that you have to watch out for as booksellers, but also especially you have to watch out for as the government increasingly wants to favor certain perspectives over others. And that is the real threat to bookselling when it comes to curation. Freedom of the press impacts booksellers in terms of publishers and authors being sued because of books that come out about certain public figures. And freedom of assembly is important not only because as booksellers, that's part of how you make your collective voice heard, but also because the freedom of assembly can sometimes be abused to try to force booksellers to close their doors. So understanding the limits of the freedom of assembly is just as important as understanding its important functions. And finally, the freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances. We have seen recently booksellers band together and petition the government to protect themselves and to protect each other. And one of the takeaways, just to spoil the ending a little bit, is that I'm going to encourage you to keep petitioning the government and to follow what ABFE is doing as a way of understanding when you can and really must petition the government to make sure that these freedoms aren't further eroded. So let's talk about that's what the First Amendment is. Let's talk about what it's not, because there are a lot of misconceptions about it. The First Amendment stops government censorship. It does not stop people from being profoundly annoying. As a free expression advocate, I'm glad that it doesn't stop people from being profoundly annoying. As a freedom of expression advocate who's sometimes profoundly annoying, I'm glad that it doesn't stop people from being profoundly annoying. And, as a human woman walking around this earth, I am sometimes wish that it did, right? But here's the good news. It does not stop people from being criticized for their perspectives, for their actions, for the things that they say. So this is the balance, right? People can say whatever they want, and they can also be criticized for that. It's called discourse, and it's really important. Freedom of speech does not mean that every person is entitled to every platform. As the keepers of your respective platforms, this is really important to keep in mind. If someone says, you have to stock my book, otherwise it is censorship, that's just not true. You have control over your platform. You can say, this doesn't fit our vibe. You can say, I have never heard of this and I don't have time to read it, and frankly, we don't have any room on our shelves. You can say, no, thank you, I don't like being told what to do. These are all things that are okay for you to do. It's called curation. They can look it up. And the last point here is that freedom of speech doesn't mean that every idea is equally good and smart and benevolent. One of the reasons that we need freedom of speech is so that we can have discourse, which is part of how we figure out what ideas we think are good and smart and benevolent, right? So that's the real purpose of it. If someone doesn't like that you're criticizing them and says, hey, excuse me, freedom of speech, I can say whatever I want. And you're like, yeah, I don't have to agree. That's also freedom of speech. So there are some exceptions to the First Amendment. It doesn't protect all speech in terms of one of the limitations of it is the time, place, and manner exception, right? And so the classic example of this is you can't scream curses or anything else in the middle of the night in a crowded city block because that's going to wake people up, right? Kind of like that. Again, these are all from Legally Blonde, in case that wasn't clear. You cannot express yourself by detonating a bomb. But in terms of the time, place, and manner restrictions, it is important that they're exercised in a content-neutral way. So, if you're going to say you can't display a pride flag, you also have to say you can't display a thin blue line flag, right? If you're saying you can display one but not the other, that's viewpoint-based censorship. So sometimes you'll see people, especially lately, saying, okay, no flags other than government entity flags can be displayed, right? And we've seen all sorts of creative workarounds, like adopting the pride flag as the official city flag in some places and other things like that. I would say that's also discourse. It's also important. It's also working through this part of the process. But if it's being enforced selectively, then there is a basis to say, okay, this is a First Amendment problem because it's viewpoint-based censorship. Threats and defamation are also not protected. So if you're being threatened, if there's a credible threat to your safety or to your property or anything like that, that is something that is legally actionable. If someone is defaming you, which means that they're making false statements about you or your store or some action that you have or have not taken, and they're doing that in a way that harms your reputation, that's called reputational harm. It's serious. It's legally actionable. Again, not a lawyer. But that's the kind of thing that you would want to consult an attorney about, right? And so that's really important because we've seen people spreading false and malicious rumors about bookstores in the past. And when that's happening, that might be something that you have a professional responsibility to your store and to your community to stop. Harassment, that's also something that is not protected. And harassment, I'm just going to read this legal definition because I think the nuances are important. Something is harassment if it's so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that the victims are effectively denied equal access to an institution's resources and opportunities. So I think where this definition came from in terms of case law, I believe, was someone who was being harassed and wasn't able to attend their school, right? But I would say also, if you're being harassed in a way that means that you're getting such a high volume of calls or threats or just people, repeatedly showing up into the store and being disruptive in a way that stops you from running your business, that is just in terms of time, place, and manner, right? That is something that is disruptive. It doesn't matter what the content of that speech is, except insofar as it's a threat or it is something that is targeting you specifically or is defamation. What matters is that it is stopping you from doing what you have to do, okay? So let's come back to this point, that curation is a bookseller's speech. So when I say curation, I mean the decision to carry books or not to carry books. I hope this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. bookstores are not libraries, right? Sometimes they give away books. That's awesome. I see the non-binary in here, right? Very good example. But that there is a categorical distinction in that public libraries and school libraries have different obligations in terms of needing to represent a certain wide array and selection of things. Booksellers do not have that same obligation. Bookstores are private institutes for the most part, and even when they're not, they're mission driven, right? If you're a nonprofit, you still have the specific mission that you're trying to attain. That implies certain different curation principles than a public library that's supposed to reflect its community. Taste is part of curation. That's part of why people come to bookstores. That's why people want to talk to booksellers and say, what do you like? What have you read recently that is exciting to you? Your taste is actually part of your business. It's part of what you offer. It's having an opinion. You can like it or not like it. You don't have to favor certain opinions, but you can favor certain opinions. And so I want to point out here that just as the government can't tell you what to say or not to say, it also can't tell you what books to carry. That's called compelled speech in terms of free speech. It can't tell you what not to carry. That would be called prior restraint. It's saying you can't sell this book. It's not punishing you for selling a book after the fact, but saying you can't have it in your store. As private businesses, you are treated as an individual, right? And just the same free speech rights that protect an individual protect a bookstore in terms of curation. And so some people sometimes think that just the first approach here to running a bookstore, to curation, the first approach, carrying all perspectives on major issues, so representing all sides. If something is a major issue, it's going to be reflected in your store. Some people like to say that that's the only valid pro-free expression approach that a bookstore can take. I don't think that's true, and I want to make the argument of why. I think these other two approaches that I have listed here are equally valid and equally important to a society defined by free expression. So opinionated curation, where maybe you are covering all issues, but you in your curation want to weigh in and say, actually, these are the viewpoints I want to cover. These ones don't fit the vibe. They don't fit our curation principles. These are not the perspectives I want to put forth. That's not how I want to do my curation. That's fine. You can do that. Activist curation, where maybe you're going to focus on a specific identity or topic, right? Where you want to focus on underrepresented voices or a specific subset of underrepresented voices. That is valid and important and fills a very particular niche. And so when I say that first perspective is not the only valid one, some people are going to say, well, then that's its own kind of censorship if people can't go to the bookstore and get whatever book they want. And I want those people to zoom out a little bit. I want you to think not about the individual bookstore, but the entire marketplace. Because if every bookstore was approaching their curation in the same way, then, you would have more or less books, more or less representing the same subsection of books, depending on how big your shelves are. And if someone wanted to go to an indie bookstore and get some deeper cuts, get some less represented perspectives, then they would only be able to find it at the biggest bookstores. But when you zoom out and think of the entire marketplace, you can have the queer bookstore that is going to carry books that might not be represented at the Strand, or it might not be represented at anywhere other than the Strand or at Powell's. It might not even be represented there. That's their curation. You could have a store that is going to say, okay, we want to have all many different sort of parts of a specific perspective on a specific issue. That's a bookstore that you can go to and talk to that bookseller and really kind of understand the nuances of the positions that they're kind of carrying and representing. That doesn't mean that you can't go elsewhere and find different curation. You can do that. But when you zoom out and think about all of these different bookstores, especially in the age of the internet, that have different curation, that's going to create a wider representation of books overall. So I think about who is maybe everyone right now, maybe most bookstores are going to have James, right? But by Percival Everett. But if you're going to go to a bookstore that focuses on underrepresented voices or focuses on Black books, there is a deeper set of books that are going to go back in history, that are going to have less represented authors, indie published authors, and things like that you might not be able to find somewhere else. So just in brief legal defense of this idea that curation is speech, I want to point to potentially a surprising bit of case law here. What I think of as the gay cake / gay wedding website case, right? 303 Creative versus Elena's. So I have, as you can imagine, so many problems with this Supreme Court decision, right? Which said that someone who decided that they didn't want to make a website for someone because it was a website for a gay wedding, the way that the whole case played out and the arguments, let's get a drink after, I'll tell you about it, right? But for now, what I want to point to is just that even though that what that case said was not that you can discriminate against certain customers based on their identity, it was a narrower position than that said that a business has a right not to sell certain things to anyone. I interpret that, and so does the ACLU's David Cole, who is a lawyer, interprets that as a right to curate. So I have a lot of problems with this decision, but if that's going to be the legal standard, then you have a right to use it as you see fit. It applies to you just like it applies to someone else. So let's talk about the big exception to this, the obscenity exception. And again, I'm going to talk about what obscenity is and what it's not. So the First Amendment doesn't protect legally obscene speech or media. That is often an alarming statement to people because obscenity seems like it's a very subjective category, right? And that's true in a way, and in a way it's not true. It is specifically defined in U.S. law by Miller versus California, a 1973 Supreme Court case based on a man who mailed unsolicited pamphlets that included lewd photographs. So this case and the decision here led to the construction of what's called the Miller test. It's a 3-pronged test to determine what is and is not obscenity. Prong number 1 would the average person applying contemporary community standards, that's pretty subjective. Hear that subjective part? That is definitely subjective, and it's one of the places where things get kind of messy. But you have to take the thing as a whole. So applying contemporary community standards, would someone find the work taken as a whole, so not just little excerpts, not just little quotes, not one word, but actually the work as a whole, does it appeal to the prurient interest? Prurient means not just sexual, but overwhelmingly sexual, kind of obsessively sexual. It's a very particular word that has excess built into it. That's prong number 1. Prong number 2, does a work depict or describe in a patently offensive way, again, subjective but important, sexual conduct that's specifically defined by the applicable state law? So it's not all sexual conduct. It is patently offensive sexual conduct as is defined by state law. That'll differ a little bit by state, but for the most part, it ends up being pretty specific. And then finally, and this is the kicker, the 3rd prong, in order to be found obscene, a work has to, taken as a whole, lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. That is an extremely high bar. It is something that is very difficult to say definitively, this work lacks literary or artistic value. As those of you who know me know, I used to be an English professor. I dream of a time when I would get to come in and defend like the literary and artistic value of genderqueer. If anyone sees an opportunity, I would love to because I have a lot of thoughts on it, as you can imagine. But that means that something like genderqueer, that means that something like Beloved, right? That even though it contains sexual content, and even though people are trying to say, this is obscene, if you're going to walk in here and tell me that Toni Morrison and that Maya Kobabe do not have literary and artistic value, that their works don't, I am going to laugh in your face. And any judge worth their salt, I think, also should. And so far, this has held up in court. This is something that, as long as the existing legal precedent stands, has held up in court, whether it's a Trump-appointed judge, a Bush-appointed judge, or an Obama-appointed judge, right? Those judges are all upholding this standard relatively faithfully. So that's obscene material. Sometimes people would think pornography would fall under that obscenity category. It actually, for the most part, doesn't. It falls under a different category, which is material that's harmful to minors. And so that comes from a different case, Ginsburg v. New York, 1968. And what that case did was approve a variable obscenity standard depending on age. So something might be obscene for a 10-year-old that is not obscene for a 20-year-old, right? Think about age verification, you have to be 18 to view this content, etc., all that stuff. That's all based on harmful to minors. Pornography mostly falls under this harmful to minors category, at least pornography that is not illegal, which would fall under an obscene category. So if you're thinking about whether something can be displayed in your store without any kind of restrictions on who can access it or age verification, this is what you should be thinking of. It's basically take the Miller test and apply it to minors. Does this appeal to the prurient interest of minors? Is it patently offensive to minors according to contemporary community standards? Does it lack all literary and artistic value for minors, right? So again, there is a little bit of subjectivity in there, but another rule of thumb is that if something is borderline obscene, it has to be something that minors are not able to access. And the way that that plays out in practice is that it ends up being, think of the oldest minor. So if it's something that is obscene for a 16 or 17-year-old, that is what limits display. So if something is okay for a 16 or 17-year-old, but not okay maybe by most people would say for a 6-year-old, that's not something that you need to restrict in the store. And again, if you have specific questions about all this, I'm happy to talk about it, but if you need legal advice, talk to a lawyer, right? But for the most part, the inclusion of literary and artistic value means that this isn't something that you really have to worry about that much as long as you're applying basic common sense and are aware of the Miller test. So part of the reason I'm telling you all this while also saying that you don't, and I'll just skip through this quickly, this is the oldest minor standard, and I just want to point out here that this actually comes from case law in which ABA was a named plaintiff, right? This is from 1988. This created that display law because Virginia was trying to be more restrictive about what could be displayed in bookstores. And again, not legal advice. Part of the reason I want to talk about this while telling you that, even though I'm telling you that you don't have to worry about it, is because people are abusing the idea of obscenity and are abusing the idea of pornography to try to restrict what people can carry in bookstores, in libraries, and in schools. And we need to know what obscenity actually means so that when someone is saying it means something else, we can call them on it specifically and with receipts. So here are some of the ways that people are manipulating it. They like to say that something is obscene or harmful to minors or pornographic because they don't like it for ideological reasons. In this environment, whenever you hear someone saying this book is obscene and waving, I wish I were making this up, a book by Eric Carle, Very Hungry Caterpillar, etc., like that one, you should treat that with this extreme skepticism, and you should apply the Miller test, apply the harmful to minors test, and call them on it. And when I say apply those tests, I mean remember that a work has to appeal to prurient interest, be patently offensive, and lack serious value. And here's some language that you can use when someone says that something is obscene. I object. You can tell them why it's not obscene. You can defend the literary and artistic value until the cows come home. And you can do that in a school board meeting. You can do it in your bookstore. You can do it in a library board meeting. You can do it in the public square. And if you want to send me an email or call me, I will help you prepare to do that, because this is the most important thing that we as book people can be doing right now. So why are they doing this? Why are they abusing the obscenity standard? Would anyone like to guess? It's the usual reasons. Animus, identity-based animus for the most part, or sometimes, just to keep it interesting, ideological animus. So one of the ways they do it is by selective policing of sexual content, calling sexual content in contexts that someone doesn't like obscene, while also allowing things that they do like to either go without examination or go unenforced. So again, the problem here is not that they're not enforcing this on enough things. The problem is that they are going out of their way to find excuses to try to enforce it on certain things. And even if they're not ultimately successful, it can still create a chilling effect where anyone in their right mind who doesn't want to go through that kind of circus is going to think twice before stalking a book. Sometimes that's called soft censorship. Sometimes it's called shadow banning. All of these things are basically relying on the chilling effect. In particular, people like to look for opportunities to say that something is sexual or obscene in books by authors of color. If you look at the stats from PEN America and ALA, it's reflected year after year after year. Sometimes it means redefining pornography as contains LGBTQ plus identities. That is happening more and more. And I'm telling you to use receipts, so I'm going to bring my own receipts. Here are 3 examples of how this works. Number 1, Beloved. Toni Morrison. Again, nobody in their right mind can say that this lacks literary and artistic value. You just can't. It won a Pulitzer. Even if it doesn't mean you have to like it, but it means that you can't say it is utterly without that kind of value, in my view. It does discuss sex. Some of the discussions of sex are about sexual assault. Maybe you don't think your 6-year-old is ready for that. I think you're probably right. But your college-bound 17-year-old who wants to be an English major probably should read Toni Morrison, right? And you should talk to them about it. You should have some hard conversations with them. A book is a really good opportunity to do that. What we can say is that those discussions of sexual assault or the discussions of sex that are more positive in this book or other books, that the point is not to titillate. It's not pornography. The point of pornography is clear. The point of Beloved is vast and complex. Let's talk. So that's what I would call a selective enforcement, a selective scrutiny, let's say. Number 2, Angie Thomas, The Hate You Give. This one is just straight up ideological censorship. The reasons why this has been banned in many schools and libraries is because it doesn't present a police perspective. That's not, remember the First Amendment? Remember that thing we were talking about before? Kind of the whole point of this presentation? Yeah, that ain't it. That doesn't work. That's viewpoint-based censorship. Even saying you can only carry books that present both sides of every issue. First of all, it means you're going to have a bunch of boring books. Number 2, it means that it's favoring and disfavoring certain perspectives. And then finally, And Tango Makes 3. Hands up who's read this book. Can you remind me, did the penguins have sex in this book? I don't think they do. And if someone is reading And Tango Makes 3 and it is, inciting their prurient interest, my therapist can give some really good referrals because that you have some psychosexual stuff you've got to work out. And this is probably not the forum to do it, by the way. But again, referrals, see me after. So all of these are reflected not just in the enforcement of existing legal precedent, but it's actually, this is the part where I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I promise you this is true. It is actually part of a multi-decade national scheme to try to force legal cases to eventually make their way to the Supreme Court so that one of the justices, let's be honest, probably Brett Kavanaugh, can say, hold my beer, I'm going to write new precedent, right? And what they want to do, probably based on how lower courts and circuit courts have tried to attack this precedent, is by saying, we think that the serious value prong, this has to utterly lack literary and artistic and scientific value, to say that they think that is too permissive, or to say that you don't have to consider the work taken as a whole. When you see Moms for Liberty or other book banners coming into a school board meeting and reading one sentence out of the book and saying, therefore, this book is pornography, what they're doing is ignoring that injunction that requirement to consider the work as a whole. They're saying, if this has one sentence I don't like, the book is banned. We can argue about, and there's plenty of room for reasonable people to disagree about what specific things they want their own kids to be exposed to. That's an entirely different question than should one administrator or one parent be allowed to make that decision for every other parent. And if the Supreme Court has an opportunity to write new precedent, that is exactly what could potentially happen. This isn't speculative. I have receipts, as usual. Just from this past legislative session, we've seen bills that are very clearly designed to be attacks on the Miller test, to be attacks on what is considered permissible or not permissible. They're starting with schools and libraries, but they will not stop there, right? That is the first step. Florida HB 1539 is a bill that failed in Florida. Thank you, amazing Florida advocates, including many booksellers who drove hours to get to the Capitol to try to testify, only to see the committee hearing be rescheduled until the next day. And then they came back, right? So really, really, really amazing work went into making sure this bill failed. It would have said that the serious value prong of the Miller test did not apply in educational settings. That is an attack on the legal standard. Texas SB 13, which did pass, even though testimony in committee overwhelmingly against the bill went past 3 a.m. And that committee meeting started at 8 a.m., right? That's almost 24 hours. This bill added indecent content and profane content, both of which were really badly defined, to things that would prohibit a book from being acquired in a school, or that would allow it to be removed from a school library. That is not considering the work as a whole. It is not abiding by the Miller standard. It will probably be challenged, and depending on how that goes, it's possible that the Supreme Court will have a chance to weigh in on it. Another one that comes for booksellers directly where you live are attempts to create civil liability for carrying harmful to minors content or allowing a minor to access harmful to minors content. So you already don't do that. I feel very confident in saying that you are not letting 6-year-olds come in and peruse pornography. You probably don't, for the most part, carry pornography. But it doesn't stop someone, if there's a civil cause of action, from suing you claiming that you have. And even if you'll eventually win that case, it could take years for you to recover legal fees, if you're able to recover legal fees at all. And there could be such a high volume of cases that it ends up making more financial sense just to settle. In other situations where there's a civil cause of action that can be used against bookstores, we've seen little cottage industries emerge where people sue, hoping for a settlement, and withdraw the complaint if someone actually tries to take them to court. It could very well happen here. But here's the good news. Texas booksellers are incredible. They, almost a dozen booksellers went to Austin, some of them traveling for hours, to testify against a bill that I was referring to as the bookstore bounty bill, because that's what it was. I mean, hi. It was incredible. I have not seen many committee meetings where lawmakers actually listen to what is being said. This is one where they did. Did they do enough? No, but they did amend it so that it allowed businesses to recover legal fees if they prevail, which was not originally in the bill. And ultimately, the bill was put in a position in the voting order where everyone knew it was not going to get a vote and was not going to pass. I do not believe that would have happened had it not been for the actions of booksellers. That is the freedom to petition the government for redress of grievance, and we need to use it every chance we get. So this has been a lot of information. It's been a lot of Elle Woods from Legally Blonde. I want to give you some takeaways to let you know what I think you should be taking from this presentation to apply directly in your store. Number one, it's your platform. You get to curate it. To help with this, I would suggest that you make a curation policy, a clear statement of how you approach the decision to carry or not carry certain things. Some parts of this are going to be subjective and ineffable. Do I think this is a good book? That's not what I mean. I mean, if you're saying, I want to try to carry all reasonable perspectives on all major issues, make sure your staff knows that. Make sure your community knows that. Sometimes they'll maybe say, hey, I don't think you're following your curation policy here. As long as they're doing that in a way that is not threatening or harassing or defaming, that's discourse. That's potentially a useful conversation for you. But if they're saying, I think you need to carry this book about how 9/11 was an inside job, or I think you shouldn't carry And Tango Makes Three because it's pornography, you can point to your curation policy, and you can train your staff to do the same thing. If someone says you are carrying a book that is pornography in the children's section, don't panic. You choose your books very deliberately. You probably don't have porn in the kids section. I'm not saying don't look. Sure, look. But you can say things, and this you can also have this in your curation policy training for staff. Apply the Miller test. Ask them specifically what is concerning to them. Sometimes, and this was getting into my Winter Institute presentation a little bit, sometimes you might want to have a complaint policy or, some other email that they can follow up with. It doesn't have to be an email, like an individual's actual email address. It can be, complaints@yourstore.org. Ask for receipts. Say, and if they are saying, well, these penguins are both male, then you can say, okay, where was the pornography, right? This is something that you can actually point them to and say, we're being consistent. If you don't agree with this, we might not be the store for you, and that's okay. Remember that not all sex is pornography. You can use the Miller test and the harmful to minors test as a guide for that. Remember that malicious falsehoods that harm your reputation, which is the same as harming your business, that's something that you might want to talk to an attorney about. Number 3, I do think it's important, not just as book people, but as people in this society, to value assembly and discourse, even when it's hard. I don't think that means you have to allow yourself to be intimidated or harassed or defamed. Free speech becomes harm when it stops you from conducting your business, when injury is done to people or property, and I would include psychological injury in that. Use that with care. Just because someone said something you disagree with, it doesn't mean that they have done violence to you, right? And if someone is repeatedly shouting slurs at you, that is something that can stop you from doing your business and do psychological harm. If you or your team are threatened with violence, call the police or call another organization that you want to talk to instead of the police. Call your community. Tell your community to show up for you. Call a lawyer. Number 4, stand up for schools and libraries. I think most of you know this. I think you're already doing this, but I don't think this can be said enough. And I encourage you to come out of here and repeat it over and over again like a flock of deranged parrots, right? Stand up for schools and libraries. It's the right thing to do, but it is also in your self-interest. They're attacking schools and libraries now on a volume with which they're not attacking bookstores yet. Defending the rights of schools and libraries is a bulwark, a defense against them coming for bookstores, and they will if they can. It also, schools and libraries are the place where the next generation of readers, and therefore the future of our industry, that's where that future is created. So in standing up for them, you're actually standing up for book selling, even if it's indirect. But again, it's also just the right thing to do. Finally, we have to become a political force. We already can be, we already are. The Texas booksellers have seen how this is effective and have seen how effective it can be. But we have to mobilize. We have to be aware. I have some links here, and again, this is all available on the Institute app. It's all available on bookweb.org. You can sign up for our email updates if you go to bookweb.org/advocacy. You can follow at ABFE Free Expression on Instagram. If you're not already following us, I encourage you to do that now-ish. You can check out our previous advocacy education on the Books podcast and on BookWeb. I would especially encourage you to listen to my Winter Institute session about legislative testimony. Maybe you don't have to do it right now, but as we get closer to the end of the year, as we start to get towards next year's legislative sessions, state legislative sessions, where things actually happen, where you actually have a voice, take a look at that. Some of you in this room know that I help booksellers with testimony all the time. I give guidance all the time. I try to give you information and organize about specific bills. I'm happy to do that work. That's why I'm here. So those are the 5 takeaways. And I just want to say that you can do this work. You are already doing this work. You need to believe that you can do this work. And you need to believe that when we band together, we are actually extremely powerful in a way that not a ton of other people in this particular industry that we find ourselves in, despite its frustrations, despite all the attacks that it has had to withstand, booksellers have a very particular voice that can reach across bipartisan lines or partisan lines in a way that not many other book people's voices can. We have to use that. It's a responsibility. So thank you for coming here to think about this. And I'd love to take some questions. Yes, and remember, someone will come around with a microphone, so if you just want to put your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Melissa from Macmillan. I think we've met.
Yes.
Thank you for this. This is really nice. Really good information. I wanted to echo your point about booksellers being a powerful voice, because thinking back to like the buy local movement and how booksellers really led that and also encouraged customers to just like change their thinking and act and do the right thing. I was wondering I think I've heard like rumors of this. I was wondering if the ABA has thought about creating a campaign in a similar national way to get customers like more mobilized. Like booksellers, I think, are already doing amazing work. So I was just curious if you've thought about it. And I'm sure there are downfalls and pros and cons to doing this. So I was just curious if this is something you thought about.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, it's something that we already work with so many coalition allies to do. In some ways, it's work that we're doing in the background in coalition with publishers and Authors Against Book Bans and other organizations. It's in the background for very particular reasons. And in some ways, it's in the foreground, like Banned Books Week. And if anyone hasn't signed up to get their Banned Books Week kit, which we send free to ABA members, go to the Ask Advocacy desk. There's a QR code there where you can sign up. If you are not sure if you signed up, sign up again. We'll dedupe the list. It'll be fine. So Banned Books Week is one of the ways that we participate in that. But I think in terms of like a national campaign, I think that what I'm sending to booksellers, I'm writing so that booksellers can pick up and put in their own newsletters. Because national campaigns are great and good and important. And so much of this fight is local that the best thing that I think we can do is empower booksellers to act locally. So it's actually, it's still with the buy local thing, but with a slightly different emphasis. That said, if you've got ideas, let's talk. Great.
Hi, I'm Roseanne Perry from Annie Bloom's Books here in Portland. And I was just going to say, in the acting local vein, the Oregon ACLU has been a fabulous partner to Authors Against Banned Books, and in opposing and defeating an attempted or in passing a law that will limit book bans in the state of Oregon. But the great thing about the ACLU is that they have people on staff to watch the legislature. They're there every day. They're there all day long. So when you have those meeting changes, they can email everybody on your list. So, and the Oregon ACLU is here. They're upstairs, so stop by their desk. If you have concerns or thoughts about your own state, talk to them about how to get in touch with the ACLU in their own state, because I think they're a fabulous partner to work with.
Yeah, I want to echo that, and also congratulate AABB, Oregon bookstores, readers, libraries on passing HB 1098, which is headed to the governor, and there's every reason to believe will be signed. It proactively gets out ahead of book bans and tries to stop them before they really get bad in Oregon in the way that they've gotten bad elsewhere. And ACLU, there are a lot of things that, I as an individual care about that are slightly outside of ABA's scope. So following your state's ACLU, other local advocacy organizations is a really, really good way to do that. And make sure that you're getting our email updates, because I'm trying to send targeted blasts to booksellers in certain areas when there's something that is going to affect your store or is going to affect schools and libraries. And thank you for helping Ray get his steps in.
Hi, I'm Helena Haywood-Henry. I'm an author with Penguin Random House. First, I wanted to thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. And tremendous thanks to all booksellers. In my mind, as an author, you are really in a type of national emergency, and you are really akin to COVID healthcare workers, I think, at this point in our country, where you're on the front lines and you're facing a monumental task. And as an author, I'm just very grateful for the work you do. I wanted to pick your brain a bit. I've been thinking a lot about how booksellers are in a unique position, given the pressures on libraries to position themselves as the entities that can preserve classical liberalism in America. And what I mean by that is I wanted to see if you see an avenue for booksellers to articulate to the nation our historical national values are rooted in pluralism. They're rooted in, when I say liberalism, I don't mean political parties, but a freedom of speech, or a freedom to participate in the public square that extends to everyone, regardless of viewpoint. And our stance as booksellers is highly patriotic, highly, deeply American, because we are fighting for those values. Do you think that that's a productive avenue for booksellers to think about as they engage with their communities, or do you see significant obstacles to the efficacy of that approach?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I agree with you about. I think I would hesitate to dictate to booksellers a certain argument to make, or a certain avenue that they want to pursue it, because sometimes booksellers are going to say, look, I want to exemplify that ideal by dissenting. Right? By saying, actually, I don't really want to engage with the idea of America right now. Actually, I want to push against it. And that to me is just as effective a way of getting that idea across and keeping it active in the public discourse as possible. That said, I mean, that's I think the way that I am approaching it, I think, is trying to just raise awareness about the fact that booksellers are doing that work and are doing that work of keeping free expression going. But I love that idea. And I also want to, keep in mind that it might not always look the same when people are doing that. And that's one of the big challenges of this work, right? Of free expression work in particular. How do you embrace a multitude of voices and approaches and perspectives while also really trying to get the message out there about how important that multitude is? So it's kind of a wonky answer in some ways, but again, I think both of your questions, you and then my friend from Macmillan here, I think that both of you are sort of pointing in similar directions of starting some kind of movement about the place of booksellers in defending that particular idea. I will say I'm starting to work on a project that is about the history of booksellers and the history of booksellers and creating legal precedent and creating cultural precedent, really, of defending precisely those ideals. So keep an eye out for that. Subscribe to the emails and you'll hear about it. Thank you. We have time for one, maybe two more questions. Let's do two. They can drag me out of here.
Thank you. Hello. I'm Alec. I'm with Field Day Books and Bottles. We're opening here in Portland next month. And per that, we're kind of in a unique position in that we just signed a lease like a month or so ago. It was a whole process. And as part of that, our lease included a lot of things, one of which was like the landlord could prevent us from displaying anything that could be deemed offensive. And we were able to, like, luckily they were very nice and like understood our concerns around that, being like queer booksellers, neurodivergent booksellers, like, but like seemed to be a pretty standard thing included in leases, especially like commercial leases. And like, had we not read that closely, that could have very easily snuck in there. And I'm curious, like, what kind of defense we have against that in cases where like your landlord is not as amenable to writing those things out of the lease, etc.
This is such an important point. Thank you for raising it. Read your leases carefully and watch out for that specifically. That is a call a lawyer situation. What's that? Yeah, get a lawyer who can negotiate that lease with you. Some element of that is quite common in commercial leases, but sometimes landlords will just, or whoever their representation is, will find a lease that has something in that goes a lot further than they actually even intend. And so that isn't necessarily always going to be an oppositional discussion. Sometimes you can come in and say, listen, we have some concerns about this. It seems, I'm not sure it's legal and it's really broad, and it would make us pretty nervous about our liability. So let's talk. And you might be able to revise it. In some case, if you do have a lease that has that in it, I would say, again, it's worth talking to a lawyer about what exactly your liability might be, but some version of that in a commercial lease is disturbingly common, I would say. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're in danger. A lot of it depends on who your landlord is. There's one more question here, I think.
Hi, I'm Christy. I'm from Quellbridge Books in Raleigh, North Carolina. In North Carolina, we have a new House bill that passed the House, obviously. It's 636, and it is essentially creating committees to be able to redline book fair material coming in from any book fair source, whether it's Scholastic or an indie bookstore. And I guess my question is, I haven't heard a ton about that yet. So I'm curious how we get the bookstores together in North Carolina and what our next steps should really be.
Yeah, thank you for raising this as well. So the situation is it passed the House, went to the Senate, and the Senate I believe just finished or is just finishing up their budget. So there's potential there to start moving soon. If anyone wants to write an op-ed about it, I'm kind of looking at you here, which no pressure. I can offer any kind of support for that. That's actually a really useful thing to do when we want to get out ahead of a bill and want to let people know that, hey, you might not want to move this bill forward because we're watching and we're paying attention and we know how to make noise, right? So I'm actually working with the ACLU of North Carolina, looking for opportunities to start raising some concern about it. So let's talk. Great. Thank you all so much. I'm obsessed with you. I thank you for everything you do every day. Even however you're engaging with this issue, the fact that you're here, the fact that you're thinking about it, the fact that you're putting books in people's hands is a defense.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!